What kind of leader says no to $450 million in foreign aid in one of the poorest countries on earth? That's not just a question, it's a challenge. In a world where every struggling nation bows before the promise of dollars, one man stood up and said, "We are not for sale." His name is Ibrahim Traoré, the young, fire-hearted leader of Burkina Faso, a small West African nation scourged by drought, debt, and decades of dependency. In late 2025, as headlines across African news exploded with the words "Burkina Faso rejects $450 million soybean aid," the world gasped. Was it arrogance or the birth of a new kind of courage? Because sometimes the poorest land can produce the richest pride. And sometimes, one leader's defiance can ignite an entire continent's awakening. If you believe that Africa's rebirth has already begun, stay with this story. Because what happens next will not only challenge world politics, it will redefine what it truly means to be free. On October 22, 2025, a headline rippled through African news, Reuters and Al Jazeera like a thunderclap: Burkina Faso rejects $450 million soybean aid. The world froze. For a country ranked among the poorest on earth, one still reeling from drought, terrorism, and the collapse of its agricultural system, such defiance seemed unthinkable. The aid package, orchestrated by a Western-led coalition, offered genetically modified soybean seeds, advanced irrigation systems, and export guarantees worth nearly $500 million. On paper, it was designed to modernize Burkina Faso's agriculture and stabilize its food supply. But President Ibrahim Traoré saw something else: a deal dressed as salvation, but rooted in submission. Standing before the National Assembly in Ouagadougou, his voice carried across the airwaves: "We will not feed our people with chains disguised as charity. We will rebuild our fields, not our dependence." That declaration split the world in two. Western diplomats called it reckless. Economic analysts called it suicide. Yet, in the dusty streets of Ouagadougou, in the markets of Kaya, and among the gold miners of the Nord, people erupted in applause. Farmers raised their hoes as if they were flags of defiance. Mothers wept in pride. For the first time in decades, they heard a leader who spoke the language of dignity. Within days, Mali and Niger issued statements of solidarity, calling Burkina Faso's stance the first act of agricultural sovereignty in modern Africa. And so, a single decision by one of the world's poorest nations began to shake the foundations of global politics, because this defiance was only the beginning of a storm that would test not just Burkina Faso, but the very meaning of freedom across Africa. The morning after October 22, 2025, the world's headlines roared like an orchestra of disbelief. BBC declared, "Burkina Faso turns its back on progress." Reuters warned of an impending famine. France 24 called Traoré a populist blinded by ideology. Within hours, the young president of Burkina Faso, once known only in African circles, became a global lightning rod. But on the streets of Ouagadougou, it was not panic that filled the air. It was pride. Vendors painted his face on market walls. Children wore T-shirts bearing his words: "We will rebuild our fields, not our dependence." Across social media, a storm began to rise. The hashtags "Thanks Stand with Traore" flooded Twitter, TikTok, and Facebook. African youth from Lagos to Nairobi uploaded videos declaring solidarity. We are no longer the continent of pity. We are the continent of power. In a matter of days, the story evolved beyond economics. It became spiritual, almost biblical. Western economies warned of disaster. But across the Sahel, something else took root: a sense of awakening. All farmers who once relied on imported seeds gathered in town squares to discuss planting indigenous crops again. Radio hosts spoke of a second independence. Meanwhile, in Western capitals, the mood was uneasy. The European Union announced a review of ongoing aid programs. The United States issued a cautious statement. "We are monitoring developments in Burkina Faso and remain concerned about food security." Yet behind the polished diplomatic language, the message was clear: Traoré had broken ranks with the system, and as the word argued, a quiet question echoed across Africa. Was this rebellion the beginning of hunger, or the beginning of hope? Because beyond the noise of politics, something irreversible had begun: the rebirth of African dignity. As the echo of Traore's words crossed continents, the word divided into two camps. In Washington, analysts at USAID debated behind closed doors. Can we allow this narrative to spread? One advisor asked, if Burkina Faso rejects $450 million today, who says Mali or Niger won't refuse tomorrow? It was no longer about soybeans. It was about control, the very architecture of global aid diplomacy. Meanwhile, on African soil, the conversation felt different. At dawn in Bobo Dioulasso, radio host Mariam Zungu opened her daily broadcast with the simple line, "They offered us seeds, but we chose our soil." Callers wept as they told their stories, and farmers recalling how foreign fertilizer had poisoned their fields, families remembering deaths that outlived harvests. Traore became more than a president. He became a symbol, the face of what Africans had whispered for decades, but never dared to shout: freedom without bread is struggle, but bread without freedom is slavery. International think tanks rushed to respond. The Brookings Institution published a report warning that Burkina Faso's rejection could inspire a sovereignty contagion across sub-Saharan Africa. On CNN, commentators argued whether Traore was reckless or revolutionary. One said, he's playing politics with hunger. Another countered, maybe he's teaching the world that dignity is not for sale. In the markets of Ouagadougou, women argued too, not about economics, but about hope. We were told that without America we'd starve, said Awa Konate, holding a handful of local soybeans. But look, the soil still feeds us. By the week's end, what began as a local dispute had evolved into a continental debate about destiny itself. Universities from Accra to Addis Ababa hosted forums titled "The New Face of African Sovereignty." Students quoted Traore's speeches as though they were scripture. The battle lines were drawn not on the ground but in the mind. And in that ideological war between dependence and dignity, Burkina Faso stood alone and unbowed. By the third week after the announcement, Burkina Faso had entered uncharted territory. Foreign aid convoys slowed to a trickle. Western-funded NGOs quietly suspended operations. The price of imported goods, rice, fuel, and medicine doubled in less than a month. In the capital, the once bustling Kwame Nkrumah Avenue grew quieter. Yet it wasn't despair that filled the silence, it was defiance. At the city's main square, thousands gathered nightly with candles chanting, "We will eat from our fields, not from their hands." President Ibrahim Traoré appeared on national television. No teleprompter, no notes, just the fire in his eyes. He spoke to farmers, to teachers, to the women selling tomatoes under the scorching sun. We may be hungry today, but tomorrow we will own our hunger. And when you own it, no one can weaponize it against you. The next morning, volunteers began distributing seeds, locally sourced non-GMO, across the countryside. Universities turned parking lots into greenhouses. Retired engineers reopened irrigation channels, abandoned since the 1990s. The Ministry of Agriculture called it Operation Ancestral Seed. What began as a policy turned into a movement, a national campaign to reclaim the soil. But the word outside did not stand idle. France froze 72 million in development funds. The European Union imposed trade reviews on cotton exports. The IMF, in a veiled warning, said Burkina Faso risked isolation from the international financial community. Inside the presidential compound, the pressure was immense. Advisors warned Traoré that resistance could collapse the fragile economy. Within months, he replied calmly, "If our economy collapses on the truth, it was never ours to begin with." In that moment, Burkina Faso crossed an invisible line from being a recipient nation to being a rebel nation. The risks were immense, but so was the conviction that freedom demanded more than slogans. It demanded sacrifice. Traoré's defiance did not remain within his borders for long. Within weeks, ministers from Mali and Niger arrived in Ouagadougou under tight security. Behind closed doors, the three nations signed what insiders later called the Sahel Declaration, a pact to coordinate agricultural sovereignty and resist economic coercion. The document's final line read simply, "If hunger is the price of freedom, we will pay it together." News of the meeting spread like wildfire. In Bamako, students marched carrying banners that read, "Africa feeds Africa." In Niamey, radio hosts played speeches from Thomas Sankara, Burkina Faso's revolutionary hero of the 1980s, drawing parallels between his dream and Traoré's courage. From Dakar to Dar es Salaam, a phrase began echoing in classrooms, in markets, in music lyrics, "The soil remembers." Internationally, panic turned into strategy. The World Bank called an emergency review of its African aid model. The IMF floated rumors of targeted fiscal measures, and in private Western diplomats admitted what they feared most, that Burkina Faso's defiance was contagious. In Paris, a senior French official told Le Monde, "This is no longer about one country. It's about an idea, and ideas are far harder to sanction." Meanwhile, on African social media, something extraordinary unfolded. Videos of small farmers exchanging techniques for millet cultivation without imported fertilizers, engineers designing wind-powered irrigation pumps from scrap metal, young activists turning Traoré's speeches into viral short films titled "The Seeds of Resistance." The narrative shifted. What Western media painted as economic suicide, Africans began calling the Second Liberation. Documentaries emerged comparing Traoré to figures like Nkrumah Lumumba and Sankara, men who also challenged the invisible empire of dependency. For the first time in decades, Africa was not reacting to history, it was writing it. And at the center of that awakening stood a small landlocked nation once forgotten, now blazing like a torch in the desert, Burkina Faso, a land of upright people. As the dust settled over Ouagadougou, the world began to watch with sharpened eyes. Western analysts filled news screens with charts and warnings. Burkina Faso's economy will collapse within months. The tone was not analytical, it was almost a prophecy. In Washington, policy think tanks debated whether President Ibrahim Traoré had crossed the point of no return. They called his decision to reject $450 million in soybean aid reckless populism. But as those words echoed in conference halls, something else was happening on the ground, something they couldn't measure. In the dusty fields of Koudougou, farmers began gathering again at dawn. They shared seeds, built clay silos, and crafted irrigation channels from recycled oil drums. Children recited new lessons in school. Burkina Faso can feed itself. In city neighborhoods once dependent on imported goods, women's cooperatives began producing local soy milk and flour, labeling each bag proudly with 3 words made by freedom. Foreign journalists arrived expecting despair. Instead, they found resolve. One BBC correspondent wrote, "I expected hunger, I found discipline." Even the country's soldiers, who once faced instability and desertion, began volunteering to help rebuild roads and wells. In one viral video, a young soldier said quietly to the camera, "We fight not for food today, but for dignity forever." But beyond the pride, there was still pain. Inflation rose sharply. The black market expanded. Some families began selling livestock to survive, whispering in the dark, "Freedom tastes bitter before it tastes sweet." Meanwhile, global corporations began to pressure African partners to distance themselves from Traoré's policy. A leaked memo from an EU diplomat described a new doctrine as African isolationism. Yet amid all the warnings, one question began to surface in Western media. What if Traoré is right? Even in the United States on late-night radio shows, callers from Atlanta, Detroit, and Chicago, many from African diasporas began to speak of him not as a rebel, but as a reformer. They said his courage reminded them of something America once believed in: self-reliance and the pursuit of liberty against all odds. By early 2025, the global narrative had begun to fracture. Major Western outlets, CNN, The Guardian, and the New York Times still framed Ibrahim Traoré as a populist soldier defying global order. But alternative media and independent journalists told another story, a young African leader daring to ask the question the West had long avoided: who truly benefits from African aid? In Los Angeles, a panel of African-American historians debated Traoré's legacy live on air. One professor said Traoré is doing what Jefferson and Washington once did, declaring independence not with signatures, but with sweat. His words sparked silence, then applause. The parallel was uncomfortable, but undeniable. For the first time, Americans were asked to see Africa, not as a charity case but as a mirror, reflecting their own forgotten ideals. Across Europe, protest erupted outside French embassies. Placards read, "Hands on the Sahel." A viral post from a Paris-based NGO claimed, "You cannot lecture democracy to a continent that taught you civilization." Meanwhile in Africa, the Burkina model began spreading quietly. Ghana introduced policies limiting foreign land ownership. Senegal suspended certain aid programs to favor local farming. In Nairobi, a youth group named themselves the Traore Generation, vowing to study agriculture and engineering for liberation, not migration. In Washington, D.C., senators received briefings titled "Strategic Shifts in the Sahel." The CIA's internal analysis leaked months later, warning Burkina Faso's ideological influence now outweighs its military capacity. That single sentence sent shockwaves. Because in geopolitics, influence, not arms, defines power. And yet, amid all this transformation, Ibrahim Traoré remained silent for weeks. Then, in a rare interview broadcast across Africa, he finally spoke. "We are not against the West. We are only against dependence." When a child learns to walk, do you call it rebellion? That question hung in the air, piercing through debates in Congress newsrooms and boardrooms alike. For some Americans, it sounded like defiance. But for others, especially veterans, workers, and farmers, it sounded hauntingly familiar. It sounded like the voice of a people who had rediscovered what freedom truly costs. The turning point came quietly, almost invisibly. On October 22, 2025, while Western media obsessed over global markets, a convoy of trucks rolled into Ouagadougou from Mali and Niger. They carried no weapons, no soldiers, only seeds, millions of them. Millet, sorghum, maize, the lifeblood of Africa's soil. At the city's main square, President Ibrahim Traoré stood before a sea of farmers and children. He lifted a handful of seeds and declared, "These are our bullets now." The symbolism was electric. Images of the moment spread across Africa within hours. The gesture defying sanctions, starvation, and foreign pressure marked the dawn of what the press soon called the Green Revolution of the Sahel. What the world didn't expect was the scale of what followed. Within days, 5 nations signed a joint agricultural pact: Mali, Niger, Chad, Guinea, and Burkina Faso, pledging to create the continent's first independent food corridor, free from Western aid. The pact wasn't just economic, it was spiritual. It declared that land is sacred, not collateral. From New York to Nairobi, the footage of Traoré's declaration flooded social media, generating over 200 million views within a week. Even major U.S. outlets that once dismissed him began to rethink. Bloomberg ran a headline: "From isolation to inspiration, the rise of Burkina Faso's self-reliance doctrine." For the first time, the same voices that once mocked the young captain now called him the planter of hope. Weeks after the seed convoy, something extraordinary unfolded across Africa. In Ghana, school children began planting small gardens behind their classrooms and naming them Traoré Fields. In Tanzania, a mural appeared in Dar es Salaam. It showed Ibrahim Traoré holding a handful of soil beneath the words "Freedom grows here." International leaders could no longer ignore what was happening. At the summit in Addis Ababa, the African Union, often cautious and divided, passed a unanimous resolution recognizing Burkina Faso's agricultural sovereignty as a continental model. It was the first time in history that a sanctioned African state had been celebrated rather than condemned. In Washington, a quiet debate emerged inside the State Department. Some warned that Traoré's influence was turning into a soft power earthquake. Others, especially younger diplomats, argued that maybe, just maybe, America should engage rather than isolate him. One leaked memo captured the shift perfectly. He may not be our ally, but he speaks the language of independence that once built our own nation. By December 2095, international media began referring to Traoré not as a military ruler, but as a philosopher of sovereignty. Think tanks hosted panels titled "The Traoré Doctrine: Can Africa Redefine Global Power?" And yet, despite the subtle fame, Traoré refused interviews, declined awards, and kept returning to the countryside, walking barefoot among farmers, speaking softly of roots before riches. For millions, his silence became more powerful than any speech. It was not just the story of Burkina Faso anymore. It was the story of how one man reminded the world that freedom, like a seed, only grows in soil you call your own. And so the story of Burkina Faso is no longer about one country defying the world. It is about a people reminding humanity what freedom truly means. Across the Sahel, the once barren fields now shimmer with gold and green. Children laugh as they harvest grain. Their fathers once thought impossible to grow without foreign aid. Women sing songs of gratitude, their voices rising like prayer. We fed ourselves. In his final public address of the year, President Ibrahim Traoré stood before his nation and said simply, "We did not ask for permission to be free. We stood up and took it." That sentence echoed far beyond Africa. In America and Europe, in every place where dignity has a price, people began to whisper his name, not as a headline, but as a heartbeat. Burkina Faso had done what few dared. It proved that sovereignty is not given, it is grown. If the courage of Ibrahim Traoré touches your heart, share this story. Subscribe if you believe that truth still matters more than headlines. And remember, the seed of freedom lives in every soul brave enough to plant it. God bless Africa. God bless the spirit of the free.